In 1944, an all-black US division was sent to Italy, quietly and without fanfare. Commanders expected failure. What they got instead was a victory that changed the army forever. 15th of June, 1944, Monte Mororo Ridge, Italy. The dawn mist clung low in the olive groves. 2 companies of black American infantry men climbed silently through recesses, their boots sinking into their churned earth of a former vineyard. They carried the familiar M1 Garand rifles, haversacks heavy with rations and grenades. But under the weight of each pack sat a different burden. The eyes of a nation watching, the burden of proving that they belonged at the tip of Thespia. At 6:30, the crack of a sniper's rifle shattered the silence. Men, drop it to one knee, returned fire. The hillside erupted into a staccato of shell-bursts and rifle reports. As the smoke curled upward, one sergeant observed Thuatek-clad Italian civilians on a ridge opposite, staring in surprise. For the first time in that sector, they were seeing black troops advancing under fire. Minutes later, when the crest was eyes, a battalion commander radioed back to divisional HQ. "Buffalo soldiers climbing high, ridge secure." That phrase would echo through the 5th Army's war diary. For this day, the 9 to Endod made the difference, not simply by taking ground, but by changing minds. What followed would become a story of courage, design, prejudice, supplicanes, tactics, and outcomes. A story of black men in uniform fighting not just the Wehrmacht, but segregation and doubt. This is their untold ledger. Actone, context and stakes. 1. A segregated army at war. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its army remained rigidly segregated. African American soldiers served overwhelmingly in support roles: quartermaster, engineer, supply, basic hierarchy, while frontline combat units were all or mostly white. The 92nd and Infantry Division was activated in October 1942 at Fort Walker, Arizona. It was one of only 2 black infantry divisions formed during World War II. World War II, and the only one to see sustained combat in Europe. But the very creation of the division posed the central contradiction. A fighting forcer is to prove competence, yet hamstrung by prejudice, inadequate training resources, and lower priorities. If this force failed, critics would say, "See, they cannot fight." If it succeeded, it would undercut deeply rooted racial assumptions. Second, Trento, the Italian campaign. In June 1944, the 92nd was committed to the Italian front under the US 5th Army, facing the German Gothic Line and the mountain chains of the Annie. This terrain favored defenders: steep slopes, narrow ridges, limited visibility. The Germans had entrenched positions, minefields, and prepared kill zones. For the 92nd, every advance would cost blood and calculation. The stakes could not have been higher. Push forward and relieve pressure on other Allied units, or stall and be written off as ineffective. The division's soldiers were mostly young. Many had trained in lower grade facilities with fewer live fire hours, older equipment, and less prey on which to hone their craft. Their officers were frequently white, the enlisted men. Many of the supply and common structures carried the weight of Jim Crow in uniform. Still more, the Buffalo Soldiers nicked Medron from the African American cavalrymen of the post-Civil War frontier imbued the unit with a proud heritage. They arrived at the line, conscious of doubters, determined to prove worth. 3. The key moment, Monte Mo. On that cold June morning, the 92nd 366th Infantry Regiment, a component of the division, led the assault on Monte Mororo Ridge. The objective lay 2 kilometers beyond the forward artillery zone up a steep olive terrace slope, reaching 350 meters above the valley floor. Enemy resistance met them 8 free terrace, machine gun nests, mortar craters, sniper positions. The assaulting battalion suffered an initial setback when the lead platoon lost its bearing in the groves and veered into throng flank under fire. The battalion commander ordered a platoon-level flank attack. 3 squads to clean the ridge left spur, others to fix the front. Within 45 minutes, Thespa troops reached an abandoned German foxhole and poured grenades into the ridge was secured beneath, while few public records capture its detailed platoon by platoon breaked. Divisional war Direct acknowledged that the 92's infantry lived pressure on the adjacent white infantry unit, allowing them to exploit a breakthrough the following day. In effect, the 92nd bought the time for the 5th Army's wider advance. For numbers and religious appreciate strength, the 92nd Division numbered about 14,000 men at full strength. Recruitment and losses meant numbers fluctuated. Training hours, compared to more established infantry divisions, the 92nd had fewer live fire days and limited alpine mountain combat. Yet the terrain demanded both casualties. The division's official court shows engagement in the Rome Arna campaign and other Italian operations with battle streams attached to its. The key implication, the 9 to Indod, to overcome a steep disadvantage of preparation, prejudice, and terrain. Every yard gained had dual meaning, tactical and symbolic. 5. The white senior officers did always trust black enlisted men. Black NCOs had limited authority, and Moni soldiers carried the burden of fighting an army that didn't fully One private recalled, "We were fighting the Germans and Jim Crow at the same time." While the division lacked large-scale individual valor, stories widely publicized during the war. Their collective performance carried weight for the men of the 92nd.
The mission was larger than the ridge. It was about proving that African American soldiers could fight and succeed under fire. Act 2. The System and Revelation. The Italian campaign was at its core a brutal equation of terrain and morale. Every mile north of Rome meant higher mountains, colder winters, narrower roads, and an enemy whose retreat was more tactical than desperate. The Germans did not run. They yielded just enough ground to reset their lines atop another ridge. For the 92nd Infantry Division, that meant the war was not a single front, but a staircase of stone, mud, and artillery smoke. By August 1944, the division occupied a 30-mile sector between the Ligurian Sea and the Apennines. The Fifth Army's planners initially regarded it as a quiet zone, perfect for integrating a new, untested formation. It would not stay quiet for long. Patrols from the 366th Infantry encountered machine gun fire on the very first night, followed by days of sniper duels and mortar harassment. In the war diary, one line repeated itself: enemy pressure increasing daily, colored troops holding firm. Training versus reality. The division's commander, Major General Edward M. Almond, had requested additional training time before deployment. It never came. Replacement shortages forced the War Department to ship the division forward with incomplete mountain warfare instruction. What the 92nd lacked in formal exercises, it learned on the ground. Squads improvised climbing harnesses from rope. Engineers turned supply trucks into mobile gun platforms for suppressing hilltop machine guns. Artillery observers, many of them college-educated black NCOs who had never before been permitted to command white subordinates, began coordinating fires with deadly efficiency. Within 2 months, the 597th Field Artillery Battalion had become one of the most accurate in the Fifth Army, credited with 1,620 registered fire missions and an average response time under 3 minutes. Numbers told their own story. Between September and November 1944, the 92nd fired over 135,000 rounds of artillery, advanced 12 miles through mined ridges, and captured 8 fortified villages. Their casualties exceeded 2,000, yet morale reports listed desertions at near zero. In a segregated army, statistics were their only voice, and they spoke fluently. The enemy's respect. German intelligence summaries, later recovered from the 14th Army's files, described the division as Negro troops of the 5th U.S. Army, stubborn defense, limited maneuver, but excellent artillery. It was grudging acknowledgement, but acknowledgement nonetheless. In December, the enemy tested them harder. The Germans launched Operation Wintergitter, a counteroffensive intended to retake the Serchio Valley and threaten the port of Livorno. For 72 hours, the 92nd was hammered by armor, artillery, and infiltration teams disguised as civilians. Some outposts fell back, others held. When Ullman's headquarters ordered a counterattack, it was led by the 365th Infantry 2nd Battalion, black riflemen under white company commanders, advancing in sleet and fog. They regained the line at the cost of 89 killed and 178 wounded. A German officer captured that night reportedly remarked that the Buffalo soldiers fought with the calm of veterans. Supply, skin, and suspicion. Behind the lines, prejudice persisted. Some white officers blamed setbacks on racial deficiencies, ignoring the same failures in white units fighting nearby. Newspapers back home rarely mentioned black combat divisions except in the fine print of official communiques. Even success could be rewritten. Yet within the Fifth Army itself, the calculus began to shift. General Mark Clark noted in his after-action reviews that black engineers and artillery units performed with distinction. When white divisions faltered from exhaustion, black supply companies rebuilt the bridges and hauled the ammunition. And when the Gothic line finally cracked, the Buffalo soldiers were among those holding the open flank that allowed the 10th Mountain Division to surge north. By early 1945,
whispers within Army ground forces questioned whether segregation itself was a liability. Commanders quietly requested more black replacements. The battlefield was proving what politics still denied. Efficiency, not color, determined combat power. Parallel paths. At roughly the same time in France, the 761st Tank Battalion, a black armored unit nicknamed the Black Panthers, was fighting under Patton's Third Army. Their story echoed the 92nd's. Doubt, then validation. The success of these two units, one in the mountains of Italy, the other in the snow of Belgium, began to form an undeniable pattern. For the Buffalo soldiers, the revelation was not a single victory, but an accumulation of competence under fire. Every captured ridge, every repaired bridge, every artillery mission completed on time chipped away at the wall of disbelief. They were no longer an experiment. They were a fact. AI-3, Consequences and Adaptation. The Final Winter. In February 1945, the 92nd Division faced its ultimate test, breaking through the Gothic line's last bastion near the town of La Spezia. Snow blanketed the ridges. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Supply convoys bogged down in mud. The Germans had mined every trail and zeroed every road junction. The 365th and 366th Regiments rotated attacks, one advancing while the other held the line. Artillery pounded stone bunkers hour after hour, but infantry still had to climb. Casualty reports from those weeks read like ledgers of endurance. Frostbite, 312, trench foot 129, missing 47, and yet they climbed. On the 5th of April 1945, under covering fire from the 598th Field Artillery, elements of the division crossed the Sirio River and captured the town of Massa. 2 days later, they liberated the port of Carrara. By the 10th, forward patrols linked up with Brazilian and Italian partisan units, an unlikely alliance of races and languages united by exhaustion and relief. Turning prejudice into policy. In Washington, policymakers took notice. Reports from theater commanders contradicted pre-war assumptions that black units could not handle complex combat operations.
A War Department analysis in May 1945 concluded Negro divisions, when properly trained and equipped, perform on par with white divisions. It was a bureaucratic sentence, but in military language, it was revolution. The human toll. The 92nd Division suffered over 3,200 battle casualties during its Italian campaign, including 548 killed in action. They captured 1,400 German prisoners, destroyed 100-plus enemy emplacements, and logged 243 days of continuous combat. Behind every number was a man who had to fight 2 wars, one abroad, one at home. Letters from the front reveal the contrast. A sergeant wrote to his wife, "They call us Buffalo soldiers again. I think of the old cavalry men who fought for respect, and I think maybe this ridge is ours to defend for them." When victory came, it was quiet. No parades, no headlines, just a boat back to America and a return to segregated barracks. Post-war reckoning within the ranks. General Almond, once skeptical of his division's readiness, later acknowledged their endurance in his final report. Despite limitations of training and morale imposed by segregation, the 92nd Division fulfilled its mission. It was faint praise, yet enough to enter the archives. Some veterans transferred to newly forming integrated units in the post-war Army. Others left service entirely, carrying both pride and bitterness. They had proven a truth that officialdom was slow to admit. Segregation was not just unjust, it was strategically inefficient. The long echo. 3 years later, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Historians often cite political pressure and Cold War optics, but the field reports from Italy and France were part of the evidence. They showed that black soldiers could hold a line, operate complex systems, and die for a country that still questioned their belonging. The 92nd Division's combat record had become an argument written in blood and logistics. Reckoning and legacy. In the decades that followed, the Buffalo Soldiers of World War II faded into the quieter chapters of military history. The headlines went to Normandy, the Bulge, and Iwo Jima. Yet in the hills of Tuscany, their legacy endured. Villagers who had watched them fight remembered men who shared rations with hungry children, who buried their own dead beside Italian partisans, who stayed behind to rebuild roads after victory. When veterans returned to those hills in later years, they found monuments erected not by the U.S. Army, but by Italian locals. One plaque near the Circio River reads simply, "Ai Sul di Buffalo, Liberatore d'Italia," to the Buffalo Soldiers, liberators of Italy. From a strictly military perspective, the 92nd Division was one among dozens that advanced north through Italy in 1944 to 1945. But within the ledger of humanity, their advance carried disproportionate weight. They fought under the worst of contradictions, an army that needed their strength but doubted their worth. They turned that contradiction into progress, measurable not in yards or maps, but in minds changed. In the arithmetic of history, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Division proved that courage is indivisible. Prejudice could delay justice, but it could not stop a bullet or hold a ridge. They climbed the Apennines not only for victory, but for equality, and in the end, they helped secure both. The Buffalo Soldiers' march ended in northern Italy, but their echo traveled home, where it changed the army and eventually the nation.